Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Allison Satake at LSU. Um, Welcome to Linking Stories in Science, a webinar brought to you by LSU and Louisiana Sea Grant. This is in response to our Louisiana SciComm Summit that a bunch of you, Louisiana grad students, had been working very hard to pull together, and which we hope to bring to you in person. But today, we really wanted to provide you with the opportunity to hear from and interact with playwright and director Leigh Fondakowski, who's calling in from the East Coast, originally in New York, but now via Connecticut. She's the playwright for Spill and the Laramie Project, and here she is going to be giving us a talk on the elements of storytelling, followed by a Q&A via your chat function. One thing that you can think about is if our bandwidth starts slowing down, because there's a number of you all who are tuning in, we might want to consider turning off your video. So let's see, with that, we're going to have our 30 to 45 minute presentation by Leigh, followed by a Q&A. So again, just enter your questions into the chat box on the right. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leigh.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Danny and the team for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my work and share my work. Particularly, I'm going to focus on Spill, which was a play based on interviews in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill. I spent a great deal of time in Louisiana and premiered the play at LSU. And so Louisiana has a very special place in my heart, and I'm very happy to be able to talk about it with you all today. Thanks for being here. So I'm going to put my screen into share screen mode, and good, did it automatically. So now you see the full screen slideshow, yes? Okay, awesome. So my little talk today is called Elements of Story, and then I put 10 principles of good drama. I was on the fence about 12 principles of good drama or 10 principles of good drama, but I settled on 10, and I subtitled it Tools to Make Science Artful. So one of the big challenges of working on a play about science was how to make it artful, how to make it dramatic, how to make it interesting and engaging for an audience. And so I'll share some of the things, some of the successes, and I'll also share some of the things that were less successful, and then hopefully that can be instructive too. So starting out, I put this outside of the frame of the 10 principles, and I'm just calling it Finding Your Hook. You could also think of it as a prologue. How do we begin finding your hook? I'm acknowledging that there are aesthetic preferences here, but basically the idea is, invoke an image, engage the senses, heighten curiosity, enlist emotion, whether it's empathy or outrage or some way in. And the reason I left it outside of the principles is because I think it's really deeply personal to you, about what you're writing about, what you're studying, why you're personally engaged with it, what was your entryway in. And so for me, I put also this little frame here about origin story. So my origin story is that I was asked by Wesleyan University to co-teach a class with a scientist. It was like a science art class. And the scientist wanted to take a group of students to study the BP oil spill. And my work, my body of work is based on interviews. So he had actually done his graduate studies at LSU. And so he was very familiar with the area. And he asked me if I would go with him with the group. He would teach them the science. I would teach them how to make art from what they discovered. And Wesleyan also asked me to, if they could commission me to write a play about the BP oil spill. And originally I kind of balked at that because I was aware from my past work that when you engage with a story, it's a big commitment. It's a long-term engagement. And I wasn't sure. I was like, oh my God, an oil spill, it's such a horrific tragedy. Do I really want to engage with this for like a period of time in my life, which ended up being over 5 years. So I was hesitant about doing that, but I said, I'll teach the class. So I went down there and, you know, as most of you probably know, when you go to Southern Louisiana, the first thing that people want to do is take you in a boat and bring you out to see this beautiful place. So we got on a boat. We were going to go see an oiled wetland, an oiled marsh. And I had never been to Southern Louisiana, so it was like mythical and magical for me. We were down in Grand Isle at the fisheries, this fishery station, the launch station there. And there were, you know, pelicans flying along the water with us and the lush environment. It was really quite stunning. And then as the boat turned the corner, you began to see the oil rigs out on the horizon. And I had never seen this juxtaposition between oil and nature. It was very striking to me. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting picture that I'm seeing that I've never seen before. And if you aren't from around here, it's a very jarring picture. But then on the way over, you know, the person's telling us how oil and nature have lived side by side. And there was a kind of sense of industry and culture merging. And I had never experienced that either. I had never experienced industry being talked about as part of the cultural identity of a place. So it was like the beginning of my hooks. But then on the way back on the boat, we were pulling up to the fishery station, and there was a big, long metal table. And there were, you couldn't really see what was going on, but there were like a lot of people in lab coats around. And there were these like big black bags on the ground. And then as the boat got closer and it came into focus, you could see that it was dolphin being autopsied on the table. And then mind could kind of piece together that in the bags next to the table, those were dead dolphins that were going to be autopsied. So I think that was the moment that I became personally hooked. So my origin story was being taken on a boat, seeing the oiled marsh, seeing industry and nature collide, and then seeing the ravages of the spill in such stark relief like that. And I thought, oh, not only am I going to teach this class, but I'm going to write a play about this. So that was my way in. And so the imagery, the sensory experience, the questions, and of course the emotions were all in play in my decision to write Spill, to begin to write Spill. And so the way that I ended up writing it, my aesthetic preference is a kind of teaser or entryway into the story I'm calling The Calm Before the Storm. So this is a picture of the final production. These are the rig workers. The rig workers went gambling before their last hitch. And BP paid the bill for them to go out gambling because they were having a rough time on this job and they were really stressed out. So BP kind of, you know, said, just go have a good time. So here are the guys like gambling and having a good time. So when I talked about aesthetic preference, like my way in anecdotally was to, you know, share with the audience the calm before the storm. They're blowing off steam. They're happy. Okay, so then now we come to the first element of story, the problem. So every good story starts with a good problem. What is a good problem? What is a good problem? So I've kind of summed it up as the reason we are here plus the reason we need to know more. And all of my work has been based around pretty big tragic events. Like I did a play about the 1978 Jonestown tragedy. I did a play about the murder of Matthew Shepard. I did a play about the Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill. Those are big tragic events, but that's not the only thing that defines a good problem. I was reading recently this essay in the New York Times about one of the most listened to podcast episodes of all time. It was on a podcast called Reply All. And the problem was that the person remembered a song from their childhood, but they couldn't find it on the internet. So they couldn't prove that the song existed. So it became their personal obsession to like figure out what this song was, right? So the problem, a good problem is a problem that has juice, that has energy, that has forward momentum. Like the problem is big enough that you want to know why. You want to know more about it. You're sort of compelled to investigate or study. So in our case with Spill on April 20th, 2010, this is a very iconic image of the Deepwater Horizon just offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, this unprecedented explosion out there. And as you can see, they're pouring water on it because they didn't know what to do because they had never seen anything. So the boats are out there trying to put out the fire, which obviously with that level of fire is kind of a futile thing. But it also turned out that that was the worst thing that they could do, because by pouring the water on it, the rig sank. And when the rig sank from the weight of the water, it broke the pipe, which led to the next problem, right? So the central dramatic event, the reason why we're here, is the what of the story. Something has happened and life will never be the same. So the Deepwater Horizon has blown out, right? So I've put it here as historical current event or dilemma. It's epic. It's an epic event, but it's epic to you or to us. Like, as I said with that reply all, which I think is a good example, the event can be this kind of global thing like what's happening now with COVID-19, or it can be something deeply personal to you. And so this image is also a very iconic image. So I don't know, had the Deepwater Horizon blown out, we would have mourned the loss of the men. It would have been like a big event in history, but because it sank, the pipe broke, and they couldn't stop the spill, because you had this 87-day unstoppable spill, I would venture to say that that's part of what made the story, right? So you have these dueling problems. You have the problem of what happened that led to the blowout, and then you have the problem of how do we have this technology, all this technology out there, and nobody knows how to stop the spill. So, and here are the 11 men who died. And one of the things that happened for me as a playwright, I first went down there and got to know Southern Louisiana, went down to Grand Isle, met the fishermen, really got to know the place in an intimate way. And then I talked to this scientist out of Berkeley named Robert B. And he's been involved with the Army Corps of Engineers his whole career. And he's basically like a disaster guy. Like, he goes and studies why disasters happen. And so he studied why the levees failed after Katrina. And he lost his voice, like being down there in all the, with all the moisture and all the mold and things. He ended up losing his voice. He had this like voice that was very distinct. And I started to talk to him about what went wrong on the Deepwater Horizon. And he said, it's very good that you're getting to know the place, but if you want to tell this story, you have to learn about these men. You have to learn about this industry. And that kind of stopped me in my tracks, because I didn't know anything about oil drilling. And I never thought that that would become part of like my artistic journey, is to, you know, just to study the, like literally the mechanics, the engineering, and really understand not only the logistics and the engineering triumph that is, you know, deep water drilling, but to get to know the, again, like this idea of industry and culture, like this industry for these men and their families is something more than pride. It's like integral to their identity. And so he said, you get to know the place, but you also have to get to know these men. And so that Bob B kind of compelling me into that arena really shaped how the play turned out. Okay, so we have the problem, we have the event. The event and the problem are different, right? The event is the thing that has happened, and the problem is what's kind of underlying the event, right? And I'll talk about that in this little segment. So third element of story is the setup. The setup is the context we need to care about, invest in, and understand the problem. So this idea that oil and nature live side by side, I've come to call it a mythology because I believe it's a mythology, but I don't think that that's necessarily true of the people who are in the industry or the people who live in southern Louisiana. I still think that was one of the challenges of telling this story, is that I had kind of like in the Hollywood ending of what happened in Louisiana, like everyone would change their minds about the harmonious relationship between oil and nature, and that was not the case. But the setup, the audience needs to understand that this is a way of life. It's a cultural identity. It's a way of life, and we need to know about the people and the place. So the setup is what allows the audience or the listener, or whatever context you're presenting your story in written form or oral form, to get the listener, audience, reader invested. So one of the ways that we did that is by, this man is playing this actor is playing Bob B, the man that I was just telling you about. And so he brought the industry offshore. He was old enough that he was the one who created one of the first offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was a source of great pride for him. And he said that, you know, they thought that like this quest of man conquering nature, they thought they were winning until they had their first blowout. And then he said, you know, then we were very cautious. And then he was talking about jumping fast forward to these floating skyscrapers. Everything they had made was tethered. These rigs out there now are floating, and they're drilling a mile below in fragile rock formations. And so he's setting up the context for understanding how actually dangerous it is out there. And another character talked about, the father who lost his son, talked about how working on these rigs, the most talented men worked on these rigs. They were called the rock stars of the industry. So this is one of the ways that we set up the stories, by explaining the complication and the magnitude of actually just literally what's going on out there. So then that leads me to magical thinking, which is the fourth element of story. So what is the myth underlying the problem? So in my experience as a storyteller, typically there's a belief system, denial, lore that leads to the problem. The problem doesn't come out of left field, but it feels as if it does. This is something that we kind of hear like over and over and over again when like school shootings happen. People will say, this is not the kind of place where this happens. We couldn't imagine that this would happen. It happened with Matthew Shepard too. Laramie is not like this. And the myth, I think the myth of oil and nature living harmoniously side by side, but also the myth that the guys out there, that they're taking these risks, but they don't actually believe there's going to be a blowout. They know they're taking risks all along the way, but there's a magical thinking that a blowout is impossible. It's inconceivable. It's something they could never imagine happening. So they just think, well, we'll need to do remediation later, or, you know, we'll have to spend more money fixing this problem or that problem. But there's this magical thinking that leads to the level of risk that they took out there. So the other part of what the setup, this is an actor portraying Arlene Weissy, who lost her son. He's one of the 11 men who died, Adam Weissy. And she is talking about how he was 24 years old, and this is her quote, he was living the dream. He had a boat, he had 2 cars, he had so many friends, he was making good money. And one of the things that she said was, he always would say, I'm working for your retirement, Mom. And, you know, she was like a working class person, and that she would say, working for your retirement, that sounded good to me. And so again, like this idea of contextualizing and getting people to invest in the lives of the people, who would be crazy enough to risk their lives out on an oil rig? This is the answer to that question, right? Because there's pride in it. There's a work ethic. There's financial resources. There's a different quality of life that's possible by taking those risks. Okay, so the fifth element of story is what I'm calling the ticking bomb. So what are we waiting for? What are we waiting to find out? And what information do we need to continue to raise the stakes? So in the case of the Deepwater Horizon, there's literally a ticking bomb, because there's this fragile rock formation. There's a well that is not behaving predictably. There's a lot of problems with this well. One of the men who died is quoted as having said, "Mother Nature doesn't want to be drilled here." So in this case, there is literally a ticking bomb. And then with the 87-day spill, I mean, anybody who watched that spill cam, and we're told it's not going to stop for weeks and then months, seeing the oiled pelicans, seeing the oiled wetlands. So inherent in the story are already these ticking bombs, but in particular, there's an explosion that's going to happen. So one of the ways that we told the story is through hearing testimony. So these are the rig guys, and this guy below is testifying. He's one of the survivors, and he's testifying. So again, like investing in this crew. This crew was said to be of the highest order in the industry, like the most respected. And the man in the center with the baseball cap, he's Jason Anderson, and our story follows him, which I'll get into a little bit more as I progress. And he is someone who worked his way up. He was the senior tool pusher. He worked his way up from a deckhand, you know, and he's on his way to becoming a BP. And one of the things, one of the ways that we talk about this investing in this story is that these are guys who, you know, with 2 years of college can work their way all the way up to being a VP, which is rare in any other industry. So we're investing in the guys, and there's a pride. And this guy Randy, the guy who's testifying, is defending his crew. Okay, so sixth element of story: create tension. So what makes you lean in? Ways to create tension is withholding information or giving partial information, and then using the element of surprise, shock, danger, suspense. And it's related to the problem. It's like, how much complication can you create? So in our story of spill, on the day that the Deepwater Horizon blew out, it was very behind schedule. They were losing literally millions of dollars a day that it was delayed. And on the day that it blew out, 4 executives flew out there, 2 from BP and 2 from Halliburton. And they went there supposedly to reward the rig for its safety record. But there's a lot of thought that they went there also to apply pressure to finish the job. So one of the ways that we created tension in the play, they're having this safety meeting, and they're literally praising the crew and giving out awards for safety. Simultaneous to that, the rig is blowing out and they don't know it. So that's something that the juxtaposition of those two things created a lot of tension. So they got a test reading that they couldn't figure out. And they kept showing the results of the workers kept showing the results of the test reading to the higher ups. And the higher ups kept saying, oh, it must be this, or it must be that. And they kept explaining it away. They weren't able to figure out what went wrong with the test. They never would have figured out what went wrong to the test, but it wasn't an anomaly. The rig was actually blowing out. Okay, so another way that we created tension was what I'm calling here the cover up. So this is the guy with the blue ribbon is playing Jimmy Harrell, and they had to testify, and they all had lawyers, and the lawyers were telling them what to say and what not to say. So there was this like pursuit of the truth, but there was also this way in which nobody wanted to really talk about what was happening. And this is a scene from the play where I described to you the executives arriving. And then the other way that we created tension was by giving some of the characters hindsight. So the guy in the cowboy hat is the father of the guy in the baseball cap, Jason Anderson. This is Bill Anderson. And Bill Anderson is the reason that Jason went into oil drilling. He was this man was into oil drilling, and he's recounting a scene here where Jason says to him, "Dad, what they're making us do out there, the risks that we're taking out there." He said, "They're going to kill us, Dad. They're going to kill every one of us." And his father says, "Well, Jason, you know, you're within your rights to go to your bosses and say, I'm not doing this." They are within their rights. Any rig worker doesn't feel safe. They are within their rights to be able to say, stop, we have to stop. But because the executives were there, because the job was so far behind schedule, there was this kind of inherent pressure to just get the job done. So invoking hindsight is another way to create tension. And then this man, he defended the industry even to the end. And that was one of the most shocking things about the story to me was I made a total assumption, just as an outsider, that if the industry killed your son, that you would take the industry to task. And instead, this man went to the White House and he begged Obama to not put a moratorium on oil drilling. And he said, we need this industry. And so his passion, this man's passion, and this man's also like love for his son and his passion was one of the ways that we created a lot of tension. Okay, so I'm calling this 7 the theatrical event because I'm a theater artist, but in any form, so the dramatic event is the what, and the theatrical event is the how. And this is translatable into, you know, written form or audio form or presentation form. It's basically, how does the story get told? So what are the storytelling forms that are you using? Are you using anecdote? Are you using narration? Are you using scenes, interviews, evidence, statistics? So identifying not only what your story centers around, but how it is that you are distinctly telling it. So in the case of Spill, this character in the background is playing a kind of investigator person based on me and my team going down and conducting interviews. And so they kind of are around as the listener, but they become the listener for the audience also, and sometimes narrate and ask questions. So the man in the foreground is playing Keith Jones, who lost his son Gordon on the Deepwater Horizon. What was interesting about him is most of the guys who died out there were working class, middle class people. And this guy thought of himself very differently. So he says, my son Gordon wasn't like the other guys out there. My son Gordon wasn't like, he didn't hunt, he didn't fish, he didn't gamble, he didn't drink beer. He was someone who had wanted to go into engineering and science, didn't quite have the academic facility, ended up going to mud school and was a mud engineer. And so Keith Jones is one of the people that we follow in the play. But the storytelling form is for the people we interviewed to be talking in the first person about what happened to them, and using this interviewer narrator as a device, as a dramaturgical device. So there's our narrator again, talking to Shelley Anderson. This is the wife of Jason Anderson. And here she's recounting, talking to him. One of the things that happened before the men started their shifts, they would always call home. And the last time she spoke to Jason, he was telling her that he wasn't happy with how things were going. It was a nightmarish job. And she said, what's going on? And he said, I can't really tell you everything. The walls are too thin. And so she is here kind of actively piecing together with the hindsight that they have and the clues that they had before, that they're now able to kind of put together. So one of the events of the play is their piecing together the story of what happened. And we also used hearing testimony. So this is Randy again with his crew. And a kick The title is This Never Missed a Kick. A kick is when the oil and gas that's below the surface kind of bubbles up or rises up. And then in order to manage it, the crew has to weight it down with mud, which is like chemicals mixed together. And so to keep the well from blowing out, right? But a kick is a natural occurrence. On the Deepwater Horizon, because Mississippi Canyon 252, that was the well they were drilling, was a very volatile well with very fragile rock formation. So they couldn't put too much mud because then they'd crack the rock formation. They had, they were drilling very fast to finish the job and having to do remediation when there were cracks. So they're asking Randy, like, had this crew ever missed a kick? And Randy is adamantly saying we had never missed a kick. In this case, he had to admit in the end they had missed a kick because the well blew out. Okay, so next element of story is what I'm calling the dramatic engine. So what compels the story forward? This is related to the how, right? It can be a simple convention, but it needs to create build. So the hearings are serving us because we're starting from the moment that the executives arrive on the Deepwater Horizon and we're progressing to the blowout. So there's sort of a natural build in there. And the people who we're interviewing are also like being asked to reflect back and recontextualize what happened before the end. So the dramatic engine is their personal investigation. They're coming to terms with what happened, but the real dramatic engine is leading us to that blowout, and then in the second act, leading us toward the stopping of the spill. Okay, so now I just have a sequence of slides here that leads us to the build. So here are the guys. They know something isn't right. They've done this test. They can't figure out why the test is reading the way it's reading. They're quite concerned. They take it to their bosses, and their bosses are like, let's just keep going. Let's just keep going. It must be this, it must be that. But they know that something isn't right. And then at the moment that the safety meeting is happening, so the safety meeting happens, they give awards out. People receive like watches, fancy watches, and then everybody goes to bed. And the woman at the table here is Andrea Fleitas. So she's recounting, she was on the bridge. So the Deepwater Horizon is also a ship, right? So she's like part of the steering the ship crew. And so she says the first indication that something has gone wrong from their perspective is she feels a jolt. And then the people who are experienced drillers, they begin to see mud coming out the derrick. And they know once they see mud coming out the derrick that what's coming next is oil and fire. So this is a guy recounting once he saw that, he knew he had to go, right? So the Deepwater Horizon was designed that if there was a blowout, the well shuts in. Those systems failed. And then the next thing that happens is the ship separates from the drilling mechanisms. That system also failed. So this guy, when he says we have to go, he knows he has to get to the bridge to separate the rig from the ship. But he's unable to do that because there's no power. The whole thing has blown up. There's no hydraulics for those mechanics to work. So then once they figure that out, they say, let's head to the lifeboats. But a group of them finds that the lifeboats have left without them. So these are slides of how we physicalize that in the play. So when they get to the end, I'm not remembering now, I think it was 19 or 20 of them saw that they practiced muster and all of that, but because the rig is on fire, there's like fire billowing out everywhere. They know they have seconds to make it, so they did not wait for people who didn't get there. The lifeboats just took off as soon as they were full. So there were a handful of people who got to the lifeboats and the lifeboats had left without them. So they jumped into the burning water 20 stories. Okay, so the ninth element of story, so that's sort of the climax. The ninth element of story is what I'm calling through lines. So these are the plot lines, the storylines, and the characters. And when you're thinking about story, mapping these out is a really good idea. So giving the characters all an arc. What is an arc? An arc is like a beginning, a middle, and end. And the plot lines and the storylines are a little bit different. The plot lines are like literally what happened. And then the storylines are really the heart of what happened. So both of those are related to the characters. It's again, like investing in not only the events, but in the heart of the story. And so here I have Jason Anderson telling his father, they're going to kill us all. And that was one of the ways that we kept kind of going back and forth in time, that he's able to say, like, the rig guys had an ominous feeling that something was going to happen. And the day before he left, when he was saying goodbye to his wife, he said, if something were to happen to me out there, would you and the kids stay in the house? And his wife says, oh, you're scaring me. And he says, just tell me. And she says, no, we wouldn't stay in the house because, that's your house and you're all over that house. So I'd have to move, especially if I, were to remarry. And he says, well, that's good because I don't want no new man in my house. And they kind of laughed. And then she paused and she said, but wait a minute, like, why are we talking about this? I don't want a new man. I want you. I don't want a new man. And so, again, like following their trajectory, getting the audience invested in their through line. And Jason is the main rig guy that we follow, and we lose Jason in the blowout. The audience loses him, and of course his family lost him, but in the storytelling, we lose him. So this is the moment that Jason dies, how we theatricalized it. And his father said that there was no way that he would ever abandon the ship, that he would stay up there, continuing to try to shut it in. And one of the quotes from the play, his father says, he was doing his job. He died doing his job. Okay, so then another plot line, which was pretty complicated for this story, is this unstoppable spill, right? So the guys jump overboard. There's some women jump overboard. They're saved by a nearby boat in this water that's on fire. And then the rig sinks. And then suddenly there's this unstoppable spill. It took a few days for the full scope of the problem to come into focus for the public. This streaming oil on the surface of the water, one of the characters was flying over, said it looked like blood. But in the first few days, BP was minimizing it. They knew that they had they saw the underwater footage. They knew that it was pouring out, but it hadn't reached the surface yet, so they were still trying to minimize it. But this becomes one of the storylines. Complicating things further, again, like ways to create tension, complicating things further, you know better than I, the land loss in Louisiana, right? So these are ghost trees. Due to land loss. So the land is already disappearing, the land is already fragile, and now we have this unstoppable spill, and we have this massive amount of oil that they're trying to prevent from hitting the shore. Who we are, this ship, this fishing community. One of our characters, one of the fishermen in the story, he said, this is what we do, but this is who we are. So again, when they go out of work, they have no idea in the beginning how long it's going to be. They think it could be 2-3 days. There's oil spills all the time. And they begin to get a sense that this one is different. This is Gary Bartholomew. He's the fisherman that I was telling you about. He has this wonderful quote where he says, we don't know how long for this to come back, but I rise every day. I rise every day. And so he becomes one of the iconic people that we follow in the second half of the play. And this is a picture of the actor playing him. Okay, so the 10th element of story is organizing principles. So if your piece, your play, your presentation, your essay, your paper is the answer to a question, what is the question? In the case of Spill, the question that we ended up with is, how did this happen? Which seems like a very simple question, how did this happen? But when you really break it down, there's a lot of layers to how it happened, dating back to Louisiana opening its doors to the industry, and the industry being built up and the whole foundation of life and becoming tied to the industry, and this development of this myth that oil and nature go side by side. And then also inherent in how did this happen is all of what broke down on the rig to cause the blowout. So I just have some slides in here that just from our research, talking about, again, like the problem of the blowout and the problem of the oil spill, and how the oil spill, this kind of like slow, unstoppable spill, like the first line of defense were these booms, and they were trying to, you know, put up barriers and pour water on the situation, but eventually the oil did hit the shore. So you had oiled birds and you had oiled wetlands, you had people out of work. And then one of the kind of the dramatic engine, part of what gives fuel to the second half of the play is the outrage. So this is like a sign that somebody made, you know, kind of a protest sign about Kenneth Feinberg, but it's the outrage of the fishermen, the cleanup workers, the people that becomes one of the driving forces of the second act. And so then I put the prologue and epilogue, finding your hook and resolution, outside of the 10 elements of story, just because I think they're really personal to you. Like, so you know, full circle, what has changed? What conclusions do we draw? This is related to the prologue. Where do we leave the listener or the audience? You know, and for me, like this is really like the 10 principles, are like the 10 principles, regardless of what your aesthetic is. But I think the prologue and the epilogue, or the finding the hook and the resolution, do factor in taste and aesthetic preference. So like, how do you want people to feel, or what do you want them to be thinking about, or what has personally moved you that you want to focus on? What conclusions do we draw? And I think one of the hard parts of Spill is the shift in consciousness of the characters was so small. So you had this gigantic play where the rig blows up and the people jump overboard into burning sea, and then this oil is spilling and there's dispersant in the water, and it hits the shore and people's lives are destroyed, and all these epic events happen and all this epic story unfolds. And in the end, the shift in consciousness is teeny tiny. So the woman who lost her husband, Jason, Shelley Anderson, she says, well, maybe this wasn't the best job for him in the end. But that's it. You know, BP is prevented from drilling for a while, but, you know, within 5 years, they paid gigantic fines, like unprecedented fines, $14 billion in fines and payments to everybody. And they're back out drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. So the story comes around after all this that the audience goes through, and the status quo prevails. So it's not the most satisfying ending to a story after the audience goes through so much, to have the status quo prevail. But that is where we had to leave the audience. We had to tell them that even after all this, the status quo prevailed. So where I left it when the final images was this gambling image. So I reprised the beginning where the men are gambling. And I put us back into that room before they went out to the first hitch. And he won. He learned craps and he won. And so they have this kind of triumphant moment at the end, and then Shelley Anderson quiets down and she says, that never happened again. That was the only time he ever won. That never happened again. And she has her little moment of reflection. And so the final line of the play is she says, maybe I should have told him not to go to work that day. Why didn't I tell him not to go to work that day? And then she pauses and she says, life is funny that way. And so then I just ended it with her contemplating this moment of saying goodbye to her husband. And could she have done something differently? So then just in recap, 10 principles of good drama, setting the problem, the central dramatic event, which is the what or the story, the setup, the myth, the ticking bomb, creating tension, the theatrical event, which is how the story is told, the dramatic engine, which keeps us propelling forward, the through lines, and the organizing principle. And then I just leave you with structural analysis, which is how to use these tools is you take your story, your idea, your content, and you run it through those 10 principles. And then you just kind of brainstorm your answers. So I use these 10 principles when I'm trying to figure out what story I'm telling, how I want to tell it. Is it chronological? Does it go forward? Does it go backward? Where do I enter the plot? How do I begin? And I run it through all of those 10 elements. And I brainstorm, and sometimes the answers are one thing one day, and sometimes the answers are another thing another day, until I settle upon like solid answers that I can stand behind for each of those 10 principles, and they become the bones of the story that I'm telling. And another tool is to talk to others about what you are making or writing about, and just start talking about it to people who sometimes know something about it, sometimes don't know anything about it, and gauge their reaction. So when do they lean in? When do they ask questions? When do they want to know more? And so that's another way of getting at how to define the 10 principles for yourself when you set out to tell or write a story. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Leigh, for that fantastic talk. And now we want to turn it over to all the participants to enter your questions in the Zoom group chat on the bottom right. And actually, we've been getting a couple of questions during your talk,
Okay.
Leigh. You were talking about how sort of you were surprised by some of the responses from the people involved in the Deepwater Horizon. For example, the father who lost his son, you would have thought that he would have blamed the industry. We sort of, as researchers, as communicators, we often are surprised by people's presumptive reactions because of their belief systems or mythologies. So we're curious about, how do you approach people with mythologies that differ from your own? And as researchers, this may be people who don't believe in climate change or don't believe in vaccines. What is your strategy in approaching people who differ from your own mythologies?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, right? Because you kind of come up against a bit of a wall there. For me, as an artist, I think it's a little bit easier than as a researcher. Being an outsider, I did make a lot of presumptions. So it was actually very instructive to begin to encounter. Like, I remember sitting with a woman and she was crying about having seen a dolphin come up out of the oiled water, and she was crying and she was saying, I never imagined that this could happen. And I was sitting there and I was like, what do you mean you never imagined it could happen? You've got a gigantic oil rig sitting right there next to the water. Of course it's going to happen eventually. So I think part of it was just being like patient with their denial, but also getting underneath it, like going deeper and trying to understand, well, what is underneath that? Like, well, she has to believe that because otherwise she's gonna like know how fragile it is to live where she lives in the place that she loves. And she's all like, things might have to radically change. And so there's all these given set of circumstances that are revealed once you kind of respectfully handle somebody's denial. Like, okay, so there's denial, let's get underneath and see what's going on. And it's actually pretty instructive. You do kind of come up against like a place that is pure myth, which is why I put magical thinking. But magical thinking is part of the human experience. Magical thinking is part of human psychology. So it is something that has to be accounted for in some way. When I would presume when writing science as well as telling a story.
Great. We have one question from Yuri at University of New Orleans. He wanted to know, how did you in your play talk about the chemistry perspective of the oil spill problem?
Well, we had scientists who we interviewed. One of them was Carrie St. Pei, and I just interviewed him for a really long time. Like I may have interviewed him the most of anyone, probably maybe 10, 12 times, and just had him keep talking about the chemistry and the land and the, you know, why it was dangerous and what happened when the dispersant hit the water and why they wouldn't use dispersant and what was the chemical makeup of the dispersant. And so just parsing out his words so that I could use the least amount of technical jargon to convey the idea to the audience. And so a lot of that was trial and error. Like we would have readings and you could see like when the audience was just like completely zoning out because it was too much information. Or at the end when you would ask them, okay, so why did it blow out? Or why was that decision important or not important? And they would be able to kind of sum it up. Then I would know that I struck the right balance. Like they wouldn't necessarily know exactly the technology, but they would understand the basic mechanics of why something happened the way it did or didn't happen the way it did. And then I would say, okay, so I struck the right balance. So I didn't go around the science, but I had to use a very light hand, so as not to overwhelm people who are intimidated. I mean, I think people are intimidated by science. And when you start explaining something to them and people get overwhelmed. So we just did it very gently, and we had some great characters who could be good storytellers around technical information.
Great. In that vein, I'm going to jump to Ilnaz's question. If it's, say, a grant proposal defense, for example, how can we tell a good story about the research that we did? And what's the principles of that? How do you take what you've presented to us and can we leverage it into our grant proposal writing?
Yeah, I use the elements of story. I use the 10 principles of story in any grant that I'm writing. They're not chronological, right? So they're presented chronological in this presentation, but the elements of story, the way they can be in any order. So as long as you can take your grant proposal and you can define within the content of your grant proposal each of those things, so like you know exactly what your organizing principle is. You know exactly what your dramatic engine and what is compelling this research forward. You can define those things and then you can put them in any order you want to tell the best story inside of your grant proposal. But I think that that it's difficult, it's challenging sometimes because you just want to like, you know why your grant's important and you know why you need the money. And so you just want to be like, come on, just like, get it, just get it. It's because this, can't you see? But if you take that, if you take those 10 elements of story and you really are rigorous with yourself in defining very clearly the characteristics in each aspect, I think then no matter who picks up the grant, what their perspective is, where they're coming from, they can find their way in, because you've done all your due diligence in presenting the bones of why your argument is important.
You had mentioned talking it through with different people who may have different perspectives or knowledge. This kind of is a follow-up question from Jonathan. He was wondering, like, how do you have any other tips for condensing the storyline without losing any important information? And he's asking this because sometimes in interviews, we have a condensed amount of time to relate our research to real world issues, which makes it hard to give the whole scope of the story.
Yeah. So in that case, I think that the talking it through is actually really important, because you have your kind of elevator pitch, right? Which you probably heard that term before. So you have like your 3 most important things that you want to convey. And then you can sometimes weave other things into the narrative. But like, for example, I said, okay, so they're having a safety meeting and they're rewarding the crew for its safety record while the rig is blowing out. Like, that's very dramatic. If I were to explain to you all of the reasons why that's happening, I would be here for another hour, right? But I have that bit of information that I can convey that say, oh, that's so interesting, that's so ironic, that's so right. So as you share your content, your story with just people, like I talk a lot about levels of approximation. So somebody who knows a lot about it, try talking to them. And then someone who doesn't know anything about it, who's never even heard of it, talk to them. And when they lean in and when they say, what? Can you repeat that part? Oh, I don't understand that part. Why does that happen? Those are the moments that you want to document for yourself, so that when you do have limited time or limited scope or limited number of words in your proposal, that you hone in on those moments that pique the interest, right? Because of all the thousands of grants and thousands of stories people are listening to and reading, there has to be a way that something that you've written or articulated makes them pause, right? It's just a little pause, what? And then it distinguishes you from all the, thousands of others.
We have a question from Stephen. He says, so much of your story depended on people. Do you think it's possible to tell a good story without centering it around humans?
Yes, I do, actually. I was thinking about this a lot because I was thinking about the dramaturgy of statistics, or the dramaturgy of charts, or the dramaturgy of underlying research. And I haven't done it, but I was thinking about it when I was preparing this talk. And I was like, I think there's a way that you could take a series of charts and put them through the elements of story, or a body of research and put it through the elements of story, so that it builds to a climax and you create tension and suspense around it. A lot of that is happening right now in the media, right? With COVID-19, they're leading with numbers, they're leading with, graphics, they're leading with, because it is a complicated thing to understand, right? And so they are finding a way to articulate a narrative and articulate a story. Of course, they're doing it in the most sensational way possible because they want us to watch the news. But I think it is possible to do, to use the same principles and not deal with people, but deal with statistics or deal with information.
So a lot of your stories deal with such heavy, tragic events. Personally, professionally, how do you sustain your energy and hope in the research and telling the story?
Well, that relates back to the people, because I think that in all of these stories, I've met the most incredible people, the most resilient, deep reflective, contemplative, even if their, their conclusions or their worldview or their, opinions differ from mine. They're confiding in me, sharing, really deep personal stuff with me. And then watching how people come back from things. I met this man who both of his sisters died in Jonestown. Both of his daughters, died in Jonestown. These two sisters, and not only did they die in Jonestown, not only did they take the Kool-Aid, but they were responsible for murdering other people who didn't want to take the Kool-Aid. And he had this evidence that his daughters were murderers, essentially. And so at the end of talking to him, he said, okay, so this happened, but what am I going to do about it? How am I going to live differently now? What choices do I make in the aftermath of this so that people can learn from my daughter's mistakes? And I don't know, it was moments like that where it's like, wow, like this man went through so much, and he has, he didn't just like run away from life. He engaged with life, and it was like, not that it happened, but what next, and what do I do about what happened? So it's seeing what people do with their pain, and how pain is transformed, and how people's lives are transformed by their pain, and other people's lives are transformed by their pain in positive ways. That it never has, the tragic component has never overtaken the hope of the people themselves.
This is somewhat related. Stephen's wondering, how do you deal with story fatigue? For example, 10 years later, how do we revive interest in the story for people who have already heard the story of Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill, many times?
Yeah, I think story fatigue is real. I think that's a real thing. And I think that there's so many stories right now. There's such a glut of stories. Like, it's one of the things that's happening, I think, with all of our, quarantine and stay at home, and like people are like, I think coming up against a wall of like, okay, it's too many stories. It's too much story. So I do think that there's actually like just a lot of content that you can't even figure out, like, what do I want to watch or read, or where do I want to look next, right? So there's sort of a general fatigue. But for me, as a storyteller, it's about finding different ways in, finding different forms of story, not taking for granted that people are going to sit through a 2-hour play anymore. Changing people's relationship to the stories that they hear and how they're told. So one of the things I'm doing now is working in the audio form. I haven't worked in audio before. I'm making my first podcast, and just shaking it up for myself about how stories are told. And of course, to me, like, still defining for myself what stories are told.
What's that podcast called?
The podcast is called The 19th. I'll give a little plug. It's to commemorate the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And it's women from the women's movement that you have never heard of, but we'll hear about in the podcast.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see, we have one last question from a chemist. We're often trying to explain things we can't see. Do you have any tips for explaining topics like these, or like this, things you can't see?
I mean, what's interesting about things we can't see in terms of story, it's kind of a great way to end, right? Because one of the things that teaching online, like, I'm putting all my theater classes, which are devising classes, which are highly physical classes, and they're all about embodiment. They're all about what we can see, and they're in 2 dimensions now, right? So I've been asking myself, like, well, how are we going to do it? Like, where do we even begin? And what we have, what I realized yesterday is, what we have is our imaginations. So with what you can't see, there's that place between our collective imagination we can see in our mind's eye. And oftentimes what we can see in our mind's eye is actually more vivid than what we could see in real life. And so invoking our imagination, connecting our imagination with the unseen is really, I think, a really potent way to engage your audience or your listener.
Well, thank you so much, Leigh. We really appreciate your time and all this wonderful information that you've given us, and to take us behind the scenes of Spill. And we have recorded this, so want to let everyone know that they can please feel free to share this with your friends, and we will post it most likely on the Louisiana Sea Grant website, where we had the link to this webinar. Okay, thanks so much, everyone, for tuning
Awesome.
in. And if you have time at 1:30 p.m. Central, please join us with Dr. Becky Carmichael, who will be talking about my life and career communicating science. But thanks, Leigh.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Danny and the team. Thank you all for being here.
You too.
Okay,
Take care.
bye-bye.